Good morning, and welcome to day 62 of F260 at First Baptist Meridian. Today, we look at Joshua chapters 7 and 8, the battle or siege of Ai. And these chapters, Joshua 7 and 8, are important for several reasons. First of all, just like Jericho, this is one of those accounts that gives sustained reflection on how things happened and why things happened. Most of the conquest in Joshua, again, the conquest, this is the book of the conquest, and even in this book, the conquest only takes about a fourth of the book. A fourth of the book is preparation for the conquest. The largest portion of the book is the distribution of the land after the conquest. The conquest is only a fourth of the book, about 6 or 7 chapters. And even within that, you have a disproportionate emphasis on 2 battles, Jericho, which we looked at last time, and Ai. Why is that? There's something theologically significant about these 2 locations, which brings us to point number 2. We just looked at Jericho. Jericho was a well-fortified city that, from a human perspective, should have been very difficult to capture, and yet God gave it into the hands of his people. They didn't even have to fight. They walked around the city, blew the trumpets, and gave a shout, and the walls came tumbling down. Meanwhile, Ai is a much smaller, easy-to-conquer location. Joshua sends scouts there, and they say, man, we don't even need the whole fighting force. Just give us 2,000 or 3,000 men, and we can take this thing. And the first time they attempt to take Ai, what happens? They're slaughtered. There's a massacre of God's own people, which leads us to the third significant thing. Everything going into the Battle of Jericho was about obedience. The people circumcising a new generation to roll back the reproach of Egypt and the wilderness. Now, the people celebrating Passover, even the people crossing through the Jordan the way that the last generation had crossed through the Sea of Reeds. And do you remember what happened when they crossed the Jordan? They set up that pile of stones, a matzeba. They set up a pile of stones, rocks, to remember what happened here, to remember obedience to a God who had been faithful. That's what's so interesting to me about this passage. That they won a battle that from a human perspective they should not have been able to win, Jericho. And Ai is the opposite of that. It looks like an easy battle, and they are slaughtered the first time around. Why? Because there is sin in the camp. There's disobedience to their covenant God in Joshua 7 and 8. The very first thing that we read about in Joshua chapter 7 is that some of the Israelites were unfaithful regarding the things set apart for destruction. They were not supposed to take the plunder. It was under the ban, the cherem. God said, I'm cleansing the land of idolatry by cleansing the land of idolaters. So we're going to set apart the plunder of the land for the temple. God is giving you your inheritance. But one man and his family, Achan, sometimes called Achan, saw some things when they were going through Jericho that just caught their eyes, stirred up covetousness in them, or, desire in them, and they took these things and put them in their tent. And what's so interesting is the sin of one family adversely affects the whole nation. Boy, we could talk about that, this representative role. That goes all the way back to Eden. But what's so interesting is that when Achan and his family are outed for their sin in the latter part of Joshua 7, listen to what it says. Achan replied to Joshua, "It is true. I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I did. When I saw among the spoils a beautiful cloak from Shinar." Wait, where have we seen Shinar? We've seen Shinar in Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel. What's right on the other side of that? God's calling and covenant with Abraham. You have 2 modes here. A mode that makes itself great by plundering what it can for itself, represented at Babel and embodied here by Achan. And then a mode that wants to make the Lord great, like you see in Genesis 12 following, the covenant people at their best. But Achan says, I saw this beautiful cloak from Shinar or Babylon, 5 pounds of silver and gold weighing 1.25 pounds, and I coveted them and I took them. And because of this, Achan and his family are stoned. And after they're stoned, they heap up rocks on them. So you have two mirror images. The image of God being faithful to his people in their obedience and bringing them through the Jordan River, and them setting up a pile of rocks to remember that. And then Achan and his family being disobedient and bringing defeat and shame upon God's people, and them being stoned and a pile of rocks put over them. Two piles of rocks that give a very consistent message. God expects his people to take him more seriously than anybody else. He had set this before them in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, life and death, blessing and curse. And the real irony is, for all of the emphasis on destruction and violence, the most destructive thing that happens in the book of Joshua happens to someone that should have known better. Just like Ai is a foil to what happened at Jericho, Achan and his family are a foil to what happened with Rahab. We see in Joshua, and there's constant reminders that there's strangers, resident aliens in their midst. They're not destroying every Israelite. They're not destroying every inhabitant of the land. The best example is Rahab. For all that they were called to do in the land, when they had people like Rahab who were willing to put their faith in Israel's God and be faithful to him, they were brought into the people. Conversely, though, when you have people like Achan and his family who acted in ways they should have known better and put more stock in what they could get from the land than being good to their God, they were treated like people outside of the covenant. So I wish we could go more into that, but this has already been a particularly long video. So keep reading, keep reflecting, and keep responding to God's word, and we'll talk more about Joshua tomorrow. God bless you.